This week on TikTok Tuesday, we are talking brain inflammation and how it equates to tic disorders and many of the co-diagnoses that people are experiencing. So brain inflammation is when the brain becomes swollen and irritated. This can happen for different reasons like an infection, an injury, or even an autoimmune disorder. So when your brain is inflamed, it can affect how it works and it can cause different symptoms. We are going to dig into that. So brain inflammation can impact mood and behavior. It can affect the functioning of certain areas of the brain that are responsible for regulating things like emotions and behavior. So when we're talking about behavior, we're not just talking about your ability to sit on your booty and listen to your teacher. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about physical behaviors as well. So, people that might be ticking or blinking or shaking or whatever the case may be. So we're talking about mood and behavior as a whole physical, holistic here. Let's talk about the whole body, right? So when the brain becomes inflamed, we're going to get a little sciencey this morning. So bear with me as we get a little sciencey, but that's how I roll. So when the brain becomes inflamed, immune cells and other substances are released in response to the injury or the underlying infection or whatever may be going on within that immune system. Okay, so like I said, we're going to dig into this a little bit more. These substances can damage or kill brain cells, disrupt neurotransmitter activity, and alter the balance of hormones in the brain, all of which can have a negative impact on mood and behavior. So for example, this is just an example, inflammation in the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in regulating emotions, decision-making, social behavior, can impair functioning and lead to changes in mood, such as depression, anxiety, and irritability. Inflammation in the amygdala, which is responsible for processing emotions, can also lead to mood changes and those kind of affective disorders, like we hear about like sad disorder, things like that. We're not going to just talk about brain today. We're going to talk about the whole thing. So just keep this in mind as we go through here. So what we know is that inflammation can also impact the production and availability of neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, which are all important for regulating mood and behavior. Imbalances in these neurotransmitters have been linked to things like depression, anxiety, other mood and behavioral disorders. So finally, inflammation can also affect the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal or HPA axis, which is responsible for regulating the body's stress response. Just like you, your child has a stress response. When they are dysregulated, when there are underlying stressors in the body, they too are having a stress response. So when we have inflammation in the brain, in the spinal cord, in the body, that can really affect how our hormones are regulated and our stress response. So when this HPA axis is activated, it triggers the release of cortisol. How many of you have heard of cortisol, right? We always hear of cortisol being higher, you're stressed out, and then you gain weight. This is what moms hear. We're like, oh, great, I'm gonna get fat from cortisol. But it is actually part of your immune system response. So it's a stress hormone that can impact mood, behavior, and chronic inflammation here can disrupt the HPA axis and lead to abnormal cortisol levels, which contributes to mood and behavior disorders. So there are two types of inflammation that we are going to talk about. We're going to talk about acute inflammation, which is that immediate inflammation. You get sick, you get an infection, you get this acute, your immune system's like, ooh, buddy, time to turn on, gotta go to work and do my job. This is that acute. It's gonna be really, really quick. This is good inflammation. You twist your ankle, you fall, you twist your ankle, it's gonna get red and swollen. This is where this healing process is gonna happen. You're gonna keep it elevated, you're gonna put ice on it, maybe you're gonna take some ibuprofen. That inflammation is going to go down. It is the chronic inflammation in the body that is damaging. The continuous chronic inflammation that is being driven in the body is where we are looking at the danger. This inflamed brain, inflamed nervous system, inflamed immune system, inflamed everything, okay? overall, when we're looking at brain inflammation, it can have a wide range of effects on the brain and body. And just like I said, it's going to impact mood, behavior, even cognitive function. So many parents will come to me and say, well, we don't just have tics. My kid cannot sit down and concentrate in class. We can't focus. So it's not just, hey, maybe you have a brain that's inflamed, but there's all of these other symptoms that are going along with it. I call it the laundry list of symptoms, and many of you may have heard me speak about it before. So some of the symptoms that we see when there is inflammation in the brain are tics and OCD, anxiety, depression, mood changes, inability to focus. PTSD is actually a driver for neural inflammation. So that post-traumatic stress. So I want you to keep in mind, your kids have a stress response, and it is not just a stress response to like, the kid in my class is a jerk and he's bullying me. That's not the only stress response they have. Okay, we have to think all of the stressors, hidden stressors in the body, underlying affections, food sensitivities, all of these things, okay? So when you talk about some of the most common symptoms of brain inflammation being tics and OCD, this is most commonly diagnosed as PANS, PANDAS. Many of you are gonna see PANS, PANDAS. Or not diagnosed, which is really the case for most of us, is that there's not ever this official like PANS, PANDAS diagnosis. And I'm sure many of you have sought maybe a PANS, PANDAS diagnosis and your doctor was like, we're not gonna do that. So in recent years, the American Pediatrics Association has reported that there has been an increase in the level of pediatric neuropsychiatric syndrome, or pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric syndrome, PANS, P-A-N-S, capital PANS, stands for pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric syndrome. PANDAS is what is driven by strep. So a lot of parents are like, oh, I think they have PANS, PANDAS. There is a difference. There is PANS, and then there's PANDAS, which is driven by strep throat. So pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with streptococcal infections is PANDAS. And one of the big kind of hiccups here is that I definitely think it is possible for adults to get PANS, PANDAS, but because we're associating it with pediatric, it is harder for adults to get that diagnosis because they're associating with pediatric, okay? Just a side note. Okay, so according to a survey carried out by the PANDAS Network, at least 1 in every 200 children is affected by PANDAS or PANS. PANDAS causes neuropsychiatric symptoms, specifically obsessive compulsive disorders and tics. Oftentimes, PANDAS patients test positive for a recent streptococcal infection, which can be in your throat. We hear strep throat, but it can also be perianal, or maybe they experience scarlet fever. We don't have a lot of scarlet fever here in the US, but in other countries, there's definitely more of that diagnosis. So strep is not just gonna be here. You can also have it in your gut. And I've had plenty of clients with strep in their gut. Strep also in the gut does things like drive down stomach acid. So if you don't have good stomach acid, then you can't digest and you can't absorb nutrients very well. So, but what I will tell you is that when we're looking at these PANS, PANDAS diagnoses, there are actually different drivers. You've got strep for one and you have many different drivers for the other. So as we're looking at this, in the same vein, PANS is a diagnosis given to children who have a unique set of symptoms, including obsessions, compulsions, tics. Although a lot of these kids really are wrongly diagnosed as OCD and we're really not looking deeper. Here's the problem with what I see as a PANS, PANDAS diagnosis. Great, whoopie-doo, you have a label. But what are you really doing to figure out what's going on at the root? With PANDAS, a lot of these people, we know it's strep, but what I'll tell you, a lot of times it's above and beyond strep. There's other things going on. Why? Because the strep's lowered the stomach acid. They're not digesting well. They're not absorbing nutrients. Maybe they already have some genetic predisposition. So there's a whole bag of things that go along with PANS, PANDAS. So when we're talking about this, we have to realize that there really is a holistic view of looking at PANS, PANDAS. It's not just about going to get an IVIG. So when we talk about brain inflammation, some of those drivers can be underlying infections, but let's talk about PANS a little bit more in that vein of neural inflammation. So when we see a sudden emergence of symptoms, we usually are going to say, okay, maybe it's PANS or PANDAS. But a lot of times your kids might have this underlying infection driver for years and years, and those symptoms just keep getting worse because their immune system keeps getting unbalanced. So when I'm looking at PANS, I will tell you that I think probably most of the kids I work with have PANS. They're not going to get that diagnosis from me because it's not about the label for me. It's about what's going on at the root. But I would say that my son probably has had PANS, but it wasn't a thing 11 years ago. You didn't get a PANS diagnosis. So most of the children diagnosed with PANDAS or PANS experience symptoms as well, such as depression, anxiety, irritability, difficulty with schoolwork. Although strep has that direct relationship with PANDAS, the cause of PANS, when you look at the studies, remains unknown. However, many clinical providers, practitioners like myself, will say, I don't think so. There's so many drivers of PANS, that neural inflammation. And it can be caused by many things. So infections, food, metabolic issues, environmental factors. So what we're eating, what's in our environment, what are those underlying triggers? This is where all of this testing I do with my clients comes in, is we want to know what those underlying triggers are. What are those things that are really driving this inflammation in the body? And remember that inflammation is not usually just systemic. It is if you twist your ankle. But in general, if you have chronic inflammation, it is going to be throughout your whole body, affecting your pinky finger all the way to your brain. So we have to look at what are these inflammatory influences that our children are exposed to, especially when it comes to PANS. If we're focusing on the neural inflammation piece and we're focusing on the PANS, we start to miss pieces of the puzzle. So let's talk about that. We also do have to include, there is another term that's being used more frequently, and it's called pediatric acute autoimmune encephalitis. Encephalitis, which is caused by a viral infection, is swelling in the brain. And so these are kind of connected. We're going to look at PAAE, we're going to look at PANS, we're going to look at PANDAS. But yes, we have this underlying issue where we maybe have an infection, a food sensitivity, leaky gut, genetic predisposition. What are these things that we're looking for? So when you get on the PANS Pandas network, there's a whole bunch of things that you can look for, a list of things like unusual movements such as tics and twitches, especially around the eyes and the mouth. Most kids here get a neurological tic diagnosis. Maybe they have staring spells or OCD symptoms. And OCD is not just like, oh my gosh, I need this nice and tidy and clean. OCD can be fear of contamination, needing things just right. Maybe they're flipping the light switch 10 times before they go to sleep. Maybe the pillow has to be just right. There's not just, oh my gosh, OCD is like clean freak. That's not what it is. Kids here also experience handwriting difficulties. And one of the coolest things about my clients is that so many of them will send me pictures of like before handwriting and after handwriting. And there is a huge difference. I have an adult client who's blown away about how her handwriting improved when we started to reduce all of the inflammation in her body and target the things that needed to be targeted. Watch your kids' handwriting. If you're working with us, one of the coolest things is to watch your kids' handwriting and see how it improves. It definitely improved in our house. Some of the other symptoms can be eating disorders, separation anxiety, irritability, outbursts of rage, and there's different degrees depending on how long your kid has been dealing with these symptoms. So let's talk a little bit about how I view the brain inflammation. So from my experience as a practitioner and as a parent, I am certain that tics are not something that is purely neurological. It is not something that solely impacts the brain alone. Period. I am going to shout it from the rooftops. Tics are not purely neurological. They are not. The other symptoms you're experiencing, the anxiety, the depression, they are not purely neurological. Hear me say it over and over and over and over again. I will put this on repeat. I'm going to put it in my FAQ on repeat. Tics are not purely neurological. There are other underlying drivers. And it is not solely the brain alone. So if you're going to a neurologist and they're just saying, oh, you have tics, go home and ignore it, it is not just in the brain alone. Period. I'm gonna shout from the rooftops. Ultimately, a tic is a symptom telling you that your body is not in the best state of balance. Tics are like your child's check engine light. Check engine light comes on in your car. You might be naughty and drive around for a little while, but eventually you're gonna take that car to the mechanic. They are going to look at it. They are going to tell you what is going on under the hood. Tics are the same way. It is your child's check engine light. When your child is doing something that they cannot control, their own body, something else is going on. You have to look deeper in the body. So just like that check engine light on your dashboard, when your car is healthy and running well, that check engine light is not there. It is the same for your child. When your child's body is in a state of balance, we are not experiencing symptoms. Your body, your child's body, wants to be in a state of homeostasis. What does that mean? It wants to be in a state of balance. If you remove the factors that are causing the imbalance, your body eventually will get back into the state that it needs to be in, which is that balanced state. Your check engine light is giving you that warning signal every time, and it is the same with your child. Tics are your child's body screaming for help. Help me, help me, help me, help me. A tic is not a problem. A tic is a sign that there is a problem. I'm also going to shout that from the rooftops. A tic is not the problem. A tic is a sign that there is a problem. So when you equate what is going on with your child to a neurological issue alone, you are missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Every system, hear me, every system, organ, tissue, and cell in the body is connected. And blaming it all on the brain leaves valuable information off the table. When we're just going in and saying it's your brain, we're missing things, right? So tics are just one of the symptoms of brain inflammation, along with brain fog, poor memory, lack of focus, mood swings, constipations, panic attacks, even depression are all signs your body is out of balance. So you got to think about it for yourself too. If you're anxious, if you're panicked, if you are in a state of stress, you have imbalance going on in your body too. Mom, dad, you are not left out of this equation. Tic disorders are not a neurological issue. They are a physical imbalance affecting the brain. Something has triggered this event, and the investigation into figuring it out needs to begin. We need to get to the mechanic. We need to figure out what's going on. So whatever the diagnosis, neuroinflammation blocks the production of serotonin, melatonin, and dopamine, as well as increasing glutamate in the brain. Inflammation also pushes us to a state of stress, increasing cortisol, and this can also be associated with decreased brain volume. So when we start to really dig deep and look at it all, we know that the studies say Tourette's and tics and associated disorders like OCD have been associated with immune dysregulation and microglial activation. Let's talk a little science. Let's talk a little bit about science and microglial activation. So when we look at brains and inflammation and brain scans, I would love to know how many of you have gone to the neurologist and they've actually done a scan, an MRI on your child, or maybe it's you. How many? Raise your hand. Not me. I'm not raising my hand because that was not us. Our neurologist was like, nah, just ignore it, go home. And 99% of my clients have been told the same thing. It's a tic, ignore it, go home, no brain scan. And so when we actually start to look at brain scans, there are some doctors who have PANDAS patients who are starting to scan brains, and they can look at the inflammation. So they can actually look at like side by side, before and after there is some inflammation. I have a client who actually, she's a doctor of pharmacy. She insisted that their neurologist give the kid a brain scan, and there was visible inflammation. We worked on that visible inflammation. We had to figure out where that inflammation was coming from. But most of us, our kids have never had a brain scan. But what we do know when we look at inflammation in the brain is that things like depression, especially manic depression, is not degradation of neurotransmitters. It's not a breakdown of neurotransmitters. It's not that you don't have enough of your neurotransmitters. It's that you have a lot of inflammation. And we can look at those scans. People with manic depression have like brains on fire as compared to people who, when they're, maybe not depressed. There is a lot of inflammation going on in the brain. What is the driver of that inflammation? Your brain just doesn't become inflamed. There is a driver. There's something pushing it. There's something that's going to push that inflammation. So you can actually look at visual brain inflammation, but you can't see necessarily microglial activation. We're going to talk about your microglial cells. Microglial cells are the specialized immune cells in your brain and your spinal cord. But we'll dig in. Let's get sciencey. Microglial activation is a process in which your microglial cells that are a type of immune cell in the brain and spinal cord become activated in response to various stimuli such as infection, injury, inflammation. The process of microglial activation is really actually beneficial, but can be harmful depending on the duration of that microglial activation and the intensity. So prime example, you get sick. Your microglial cells in your brain are going to be turned on because they are there to protect your brain. That is the immune cells in your brain. So when microglial cells become activated, they undergo a series of changes in morphology and function. They become more modal, which means they move and migrate towards a site of injury or infection. They also proliferate and release what's called cytokines and chemokines. These are the signaling molecules that regulate the immune response and promote tissue repair. So the early stages of this microglial activation, the cells release anti-inflammatory cytokines and neurotrophic factors that help to limit the inflammation and promote repair. However, this is where we talked about, what did we just talk about? 2 types of inflammation. We talked about acute, which is this first section. Now we're going to talk about chronic. If left unchecked, that prolonged activation of your microglial cells switches to a pro-inflammatory mode and releases harmful cytokines and other molecules that can damage neurons and cells in the brain. So when you have this chronic activation of microglial cells, there's this constant inflammation in the body, those bad boys get turned on and they start to release glutamate. Glutamate is very excitatory to the brain. You end up with a glutamate storm. Then that releases calcium. The calcium channels, you can have neuron death with that. So chronic microglial activation has been implicated in various neurological and psychiatric disorders, from Alzheimer's to Parkinson's. We see depression, we see anxiety, we see tics, we see Tourette's, we see all of this really imbalanced immune function because your microglial cells are going nuts in your brain, going bonkers, so to speak. So we have to understand that there's this activation of your immune system. The studies are showing tics, Tourette's, and related disorders are tied to an imbalanced immune system. What is driving your imbalanced immune system? Sorry. So let's talk about some of those triggers for drivers that are going to drive that inflammation in the body, that are going to drive that immune response in the body. So these are triggers for tics, PANS. We talked about pandas because that's strep, and other inflammation in the body. So some of those triggers are, 1, there's 4 triggers, environmental factors. Environmental factors, what's going on in your environment? Are you using a bunch of Glade plugins and spraying pesticides and herbicides and shit at your house? What are those environmental factors? Are you, cleaning with bleach and Pine Sol? Some environmental factors. What are you eating? Are you eating glyphosate food? Are you eating organic? What are you eating? So there's environmental factors as trigger 1. Trigger 2 is going to be biological factors. What's happening inside your body? Is there leaky gut? Is there food sensitivity? Is there underlying infection? Are there toxins? Is your body making endotoxins, which is toxins that it makes within itself based on like the fungus and the bacteria in your body? What's going on biologically inside? So 1 is environmental, 2 is biological, 3 is physical. Does your kid sit on their butt all day at school and then come home and sit on their butt some more? Do they get exercise? Do they have alignment issues? Are you making them go out and shovel holes in the dirt all day and maybe they have some issues? What are those physical stressors? So you have environmental, biological, physical, and mental. People always hear the word stress and they think it's driven all mental. It is not all mental. Yeah, sometimes your boss is a jerk, or maybe there's a bully at school, or maybe you have a really stressful test that you have to take. SAT is coming up. But you have to look at those drivers. It is not just, we can't just hop in and say, ooh, brain inflammation. Why is it inflamed? Why is your body in this chronic state of inflammation and dysregulated immune system? Okay. We know that infection is one of the most common triggers for PANS, pandas, whether it's bacterial or viral. They can lead to autoimmune system responses that affect the brain and cause symptoms. There are autoimmune disorders. Really, the standard for an autoimmune disorder is that your body is attacking itself. So we all hear of like autoimmune thyroid. Your body is attacking its own thyroid tissue. It's just the easy way to explain it. We're not going to get all sciencey on autoimmune diseases because I'm not doing that today. But it can happen in the brain where your body starts to impact your own brain. We talked about those environmental factors, toxins, mold, other substances, the crappy old Glade plugins that you're using. The genetics, you know, when I look at genetics, I'm not looking for one pinpoint gene. I'm looking at how do all of your genes impact your overall health, and how does what you're doing in your environment impact your overall health. It is not a standalone. When I say holistic, I'm not going to rub my crystals on you and sage you. That's not what we're doing. Holistic means look at the whole body. You have to look at that whole entire connection. So you have environmental, biological, physical, emotional, right? Mental, emotional. You've got these 4 triggers, and you have to be able to investigate all of those. We're going to put on our investigator hat. We're going to get our investigator briefcase, and we are going to start to investigate what is at the root. What is actually happening here? So, all of that being said, yes, inflammation in the brain can impact your mood and behavior. The whole idea is to figure out where that inflammation is coming from in the first place. Why is your immune system dysregulated? Why are we having all of this inflammation in the body? Why is our child's check engine light on? So yes, we can say that there's, you know, inflammation is a factor in so many of these disorders, but why? So my whole entire, we're going to get to the whole thing. My whole entire question with all of my clients is why. This is why we test, don't guess.